Hello to you today on this Friday, November the 3rd. Our daily Devo's title for today is Jesus on his relationship to the Father. Jesus on his relationship to the Father. John chapter 10, verses 22 through 42. And in verse 30 of that passage, he says, I and the Father are one. I and the Father are one. The growing acrimony between Jesus and the Jewish religious leaders is plain to see in this story. These men asked Jesus to speak more plainly about his identity, what Jesus said, where he said it, and when he said it, struck at the very foundation of what these religious leaders believed. Jesus asserted, I and the Father are one. Jesus' statement is hard to reconcile with the core Old Testament declaration in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This language from Moses pushed back against the persistent pagan misunderstanding that the ancient world was filled with many gods who lived in extended family relationships. Now, centuries later, Jesus said he and the Father are one. To these Old Testament teachers, this sounded like a slide back into an ancient and pagan worldview. The place where Jesus revealed this truth increased the apparent tension. Jesus' declaration echoed through the covered corridor called Solomon's Colonnade. Although it carried Solomon's name, it was built much later than the first temple built by Solomon. But the label puts us on the campus of the temple in Jerusalem. Unlike pagan religious compounds, Jerusalem had just one temple, and so asserted that God is one. The setting increases the tension between Jesus' statements and listeners' expectations. And there's that word again. This has got to be the third, fourth time, at least, that the expectations of some have blinded them to the reality of who Jesus is and was. Added to that, Jesus' words landed on his listeners' ears during the festival of dedication. This is not a festival mandated in the Old Testament, but one that Judaism adopted. You may know it as Hanukkah. It commemorates the liberation of the temple in the 2nd century BC from pagan hands by the freedom fighter Judas Maccabeus. This festival championed the victory of the one true God over his pagan competitors. At every level, Jesus' statement on his relationship with the Father stood out and challenged the religious leaders. It sounded like blasphemy, but here, Jesus offers a more complete explanation of who God is. I may not be able to fully understand how God is one. At the same time, Jesus and the Father are one. But the Holy Spirit caused me to believe it, similar to how the sheep who listen to Jesus' voice follow him. Why didn't the Jewish leaders at the Jerusalem temple do the same? The answer is simple and tragic. You do not believe, Jesus says to them in verse 26 of John 10. You do not believe because you are not my sheep. So many sad scenarios. I mean, when we consider Jesus, we think about that Christmas story and the birth of him into this world, the Immaculate Conception, as they call it. We think of his promises, his teaching, the life he lived. We think of all of those kinds of things, but what it does, his presence in the world forces those in Israel, those who heard him, those who saw him, it forces them to make a decision. And their mind is already filled with a certain perspective on things, certain expectations about who the Messiah will be, where will he come from, what are the things we can expect from him to do. And Jesus blows all of that out of the water. And we've seen that several times in our devotions. The fact that they thought, or they attributed to him being from Nazareth because he pretty much was raised there, even though very clearly he was born in Bethlehem. And they didn't think anything good could come out of Galilee. That Nazareth was a hick town filled with uncultured people. And so their expectations of Jesus, they couldn't allow any positive expectations of him. And that is how it is in our world. Especially in a nation like ours, where so many have had interactions with people who call themselves Christians, and they have found those interactions lacking. They did not expect a Christian to talk like that. They did not expect a Christian to have an attitude like that, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. I have found in my life that unbelievers have a higher expectation of Christians than Christians seem to have of themselves so often. They expect them to be like Jesus, and they sadly find they're not. And that sometimes we're not like Jesus just because of the fallen nature that we still carry around with us, that we need to keep under control with the help of the Holy Spirit. And yet others have only been Christians in name only. And their lives rarely, if ever, reflect the humility of Jesus, the servanthood of Jesus, the sacrificial nature of Jesus's life, all the things he calls us to be like him, to be like him. And so the expectations and the realities clash, and they're hard to compromise. It's how it was when Jesus walked the earth. It's still like that today. And so we shouldn't be surprised that those things happen. We shouldn't be surprised, because sometimes, even with the strongest of witness lived, people's expectations often make the decision for them. I pray that the lives we live, the words we speak, the choices we make, the love we show will be empowered by the presence of the Holy Spirit in us, powerfully enough to rewrite people's expectations and to realize their expectations were wrong. It's part of the spiritual battle we face. Jesus faced it. We follow him. We face it too. Blessings to you today.